I'm sorry, you can't go in. It's against the rules. But it's so hot. I really want to swim. I understand. Let me check with my supervisor. Okay, thank you. All right, let's go.
Here are ordinary Tuesday mornings that you don't realize will define the rest of your year until you are standing inside them, squinting against the sun, your child's hand warm and trusting in yours, and the world tilts just slightly enough to never quite right itself again. That was the morning of July 11th, a cloudless, scorching Tuesday in the kind of subdivision you see in real estate brochures, manicured lawns, HOA approved, shutter colors, the kind. A place that promises community and delivers something considerably more conditional. My name is Dana Whitfield. I'm 41 years old, a school librarian by trade, a mother by every fiber of my existence. On that Tuesday, I was simply a woman trying to take her son swimming before the worst of the afternoon heat arrived. My son Caleb was 9 years old that summer. He has spina bifida, condition he has navigated with a grace and resilience that routinely makes me feel like the lesser person in our household. Spina bifida affects the spinal cord and can cause varying degrees of physical limitation. For Caleb, it means he uses a wheelchair for longer distances, wears orthotics on both legs, and requires certain accommodations that any reasonable public or shared space is legally required to provide. He also happens to love water with a ferocity that borders on religious devotion. Pools, sprinklers, rain puddles, the garden hose, any body of water is, to Caleb, an invitation to pure joy. His occupational therapist had told us years before that aquatic movement was genuinely therapeutic for him, that the buoyancy of water gave him a freedom of movement his legs couldn't always provide on land. So we swam. We swam every chance. We had moved into Sycamore Ridge Estates 14 months before that Tuesday. It was a deliberate choice. I had researched the HOA documents, spoken with the property manager over the phone, confirmed that the community pool had a zero-entry section and a lift, both federally required under the Americans with Disabilities Act. I asked specifically. I was promised, in the most breezy and offhand way possible, that of course everything was accessible. Absolutely. 100%. I took photos of the pool during our property tour. I noted the lift mounted on the pool deck. I felt for the first time in a long time like I had chosen a home where Caleb wouldn't have to fight for basic inclusion. That feeling was something I had learned not to take for granted. Because in 11 years of parenting a disabled child in America, it is among the rarest things in the world. Our routine was established within weeks of moving in. Tuesday and Thursday mornings, we would pack Caleb's swim bag, his neoprene floaties, his water shoes with the Velcro straps he could fasten himself, his SPF 50 spray, his juice box, and the small laminated card his therapist had made listing the pool accommodations we might need. We would walk the 4 blocks from our front door to the pool entrance at the east side of the complex. Caleb would usually ride his scooter for the first 2 blocks before his legs tired. And then we would walk together at his pace, which was slower than most, but richer than any hurried stride I'd ever taken. He narrated the neighborhood to me. As we walked, pointing out Mrs. Okonkwo's roses, debating whether the Petersons had repainted their fence, they hadn't. Identifying birds by sound in a way that made me wonder if I had somehow produced a small, cheerful naturalist by accident. Those walks were among my favorite moments of any week. I had seen Margaret Holloway, the woman who would append our summer, perhaps a dozen times before that Tuesday. I had lived in Sycamore Ridge for 11 years, a tenure she referenced. Frequently, and with the satisfied authority of someone who considered longevity a form of achievement. She was the self-appointed chairwoman of what she called the Pool Committee, a body that, as far as I could determine from the official HOA documents, did not legally exist but had apparently been allowed to function for years because nobody had bothered to challenge it. She organized the pool schedule, posted laminated rule sheets on the gate, and patrolled the area during peak hours with a clipboard that she carried the way generals carry orders as though the paper itself conferred authority. She had spoken to me once before, briefly, when Caleb and I first used the pool. She had stared at his orthotics for a beat too long, and then smiled the specific smile of someone cataloging information they intend to use later. I had noted it and let it go, the way you learn to let so many small, minute things go when you are the parent of a disabled child in a world that was not quite designed with your child in mind. She patrolled the pool with the clipboard the way generals carry orders, as though the paper itself conferred authority over other people's lives. On the morning of July 11th, I woke Caleb at 8:30. He was already excited. He had been talking about Tuesday swimming since Sunday dinner, because his best friend from school, a boy named Marcus, had been given permission by his parents to join us that day for the first time. Marcus had heard Caleb describe the pool's zero entry ramp, which meant Caleb could walk gradually into the water without needing to use the steps. Had apparently told his mother it sounded like the coolest pool he'd ever heard of. Caleb had been bursting with pride about it all weekend, as though he had personally engineered the ramp himself. I made them both breakfast, helped Caleb get into his swim shorts and orthotics, packed the swim bag, sprayed sunscreen over every exposed surface of two small boys, locked our front door at 9:15 with the loose, uncomplicated happiness of a morning that has no particular reason to go wrong. Marcus skipped down our front steps. Caleb scooted ahead. I followed with the bag, the juice boxes, and not a single premonition of what was waiting for us 4 blocks away at the east gate of Sycamore Ridge Community Pool. Margaret Holloway was already stationed at the pool gate when we arrived, which in hindsight should have registered as a warning. She was rarely there before 10 on weekday mornings, the clipboard crowd typically mobilized. Once the pool was actually busy enough to regulate, but there she stood at 9:22 in white capri pants and a floral blouse, her oversized sunglasses catching the morning glare, her clipboard clutched against her chest with both hands. She watched us approach the entire length of the path without moving, without smiling, without any of the performative warmth she occasionally deployed for neighbors she considered peers. I noticed it, but kept walking. Caleb was narrating something to Marcus about the chlorine smell and whether sharks could survive in chlorinated water. And Marcus was listening with the grave seriousness the question deserved. I said, "Good morning." Margaret did not return the greeting. She looked down at her clipboard, ran a finger along whatever was written there, and said, with the particular flatness of someone who has rehearsed a line, "Pool hours for unaccompanied minors don't begin until 10. I pointed out that I was accompanying the children and that it was not yet 10, that we had been using this pool at this time for the past 14 months without incident. She nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not actually listening, but are waiting for you to finish speaking. Then she said the thing that changed everything. She said, "We've had some concerns raised by residents about the lift equipment. We're putting a hold on its use while the committee reviews safety protocols." I asked which committee. She said the pool committee. I asked where that was documented in the HOA bylaws. She looked at me the way you look at someone who has said something not just incorrect, but somehow socially offensive. I kept my voice steady. I was aware of Marcus standing slightly behind Caleb, very quiet now, the way children become quiet when they sense adult tension moving through the air like weather. I explained, choosing my words carefully, that the pool lift was not optional. Amenity equipment? I told her it was an ADA-required accommodation for my son, who had a documented disability, and that placing a hold on its use without prior notice, without written documentation, and without any legitimate committee authorization, constituted a potential federal civil rights violation. Margaret's expression didn't shift exactly, but something behind it did, a small recalibration, a door closing. She said, "I understand you feel strongly about that, but today I'm not able to let him use the lift. You're welcome to use the pool steps with him if you'd like." She gestured toward the standard pool steps at the far end, the ones that require leg strength and balance Caleb does not always have. The ones he cannot navigate safely without significant risk of injury. The ones whose existence has never been, and will never be, an acceptable substitute for the accommodation. The law guarantees him. She gestured toward the pool steps. Caleb could not safely navigate and called it a reasonable alternative, as though the law were merely a suggestion offered for consideration. Said clearly and without raising my voice, my son has a legal right to access this pool using the lift. I'm asking you to open this gate. She shook her head, the motion small and almost sympathetic, as though she were declining an unreasonable refund request rather than barring a disabled child from a public accommodation. "Not today," she said. "The committee will review it." I asked when, She said she couldn't say. I asked for the hold in writing. She said she didn't have anything written up yet. I asked for her name for my records. I already knew it, but I wanted her to say it. I wanted the moment to require her to commit to what she was doing, and she told me her name and then added, unprompted, with a careful evenness that I will remember for the rest of my life. I know this is inconvenient, but this community has standards we need to maintain, and frankly, some of the equipment here wasn't really designed with every type of situation in mind. I'm not trying to be unkind. That was the sentence. That was the one. I have replayed it hundreds of times since then, in the shower, in the car, at 2 and the morning when the house is quiet and my mind won't stop moving. Some of the equipment here wasn't really designed with every type of situation in mind. It was dressed up in procedural language and delivered with the composed affect of a person who believed herself to be reasonable, but what she meant, stripped of the euphemisms, was that the pool was not for Caleb, that this community, the one I had researched and chosen and paid HOA dues to for 14 months, was not entirely prepared to include my son, that his disability was a situation the equipment hadn't anticipated. I stood at that gate looking at Margaret Holloway, and I understood with a cold clarity I hadn't felt in years that I was not going to let this go. I was not going to walk home and call the management company and send a polite email and wait. I was going to fight, and I was going to win. And I had, though I didn't know it yet, everything I needed to do exactly that. What I didn't know in that moment, what I only discovered 48 hours later when my neighbor Trevor mentioned it while we were comparing notes about the HOA's general dysfunction, was that the entire exchange had been captured by the security camera the complex had installed on the east fence post 6 months earlier. A camera Margaret herself had reportedly advocated for at a board meeting, citing security concerns about after-hours pool access. A camera mounted at precisely the angle that captured every expression, every gesture, every word of our entire conversation in high-definition video with a timestamp. Margaret had argued for the camera. The camera had recorded her. There is something almost unbearably poetic about that, and I have turned it over in my mind many times since, marveling at the specific, merciless geometry of accountability. We walked home the same way we had walked to the pool, down the same 4 blocks, past Mrs. Okonkwo's roses and the Peterson fence that had not been repainted, through the familiar suburban geometry of Sycamore Ridge Estates. No, nothing about the walk felt the same. Caleb's scooter was silent. Marcus walked with his hands in his pockets, looking at the pavement with the careful attentiveness of a child trying very hard not to look at what he'd just witnessed. Caleb had said nothing since we turned away from the gate. He was carrying his swim bag himself, which he rarely did on the walk to the pool because it made his arms tired, and he liked to save them for swimming. Today he was carrying it and staring straight ahead, and I could see, from his profile, the particular set of his jaw that I knew as well as my own face, the expression he made when he was assembling his thoughts into something he could say, out loud, without it breaking apart. He waited until Marcus's house came into view. Until we were close enough that Marcus could reasonably peel away in another half-block, and then he said quietly, "Was it because of me? Like because of my legs?" I had been dreading the question, and also knew it was the only honest question available to him, and I had in the 4 blocks of silence before it arrived. It's been arranging and discarding responses. It's not because I wanted to deceive him. I have always believed that children deserve the truth, calibrated to their capacity to carry it. Ash! But because the truth in this case was ugly in a way that implicated not just one woman with a clipboard, but an entire architecture of how the world thinks about disabled bodies and who public spaces are really for. I told him yes, and I told him it was wrong. I told him it was against the law, okay? And I watched his face process those 3 things in sequence. He was quiet for another half-block. Then he said, "So she broke a rule?" I said yes. He thought about this. A big rule. I said it was a very big rule, one of the biggest the country had, and that people went to court over it, and that when they did, the disabled person usually won. Because the rule existed specifically to protect people like him. He absorbed this, with the focused, judicial seriousness he brought to important matters. The same expression he used when his occupational therapist explained a new exercise, or when his teacher described a math concept he hadn't encountered before. "Are we going to court?" he asked. I told him I didn't know yet, but that I was absolutely going to do something. That I was going to make sure this didn't happen again. Not to him, not to anyone else in this neighborhood who needed that. Lift to swim. He nodded once, the way he nodded when he had filed a piece of information and considered it handled. Then he said, "Can Marcus still come swimming when we fix it?" And the straightforwardness of his optimism, the ease with which he had already moved from injustice to resolution, from problem to eventual solution, made my chest ache in a way that was half grief and half ferocious love. He had already moved from the injustice to the resolution. He was 9 years old, and he believed without question that we would fix it. I was not going to be the one to disappoint that faith. Marcus went home. I made Caleb lunch and set him up with a book in the living room. He was working through a series about a boy who could communicate with animals, a detail I find inexpressibly charming, and then I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and spent the next 3 hours documenting everything. I wrote down every word of the exchange with Margaret Holloway while it was still fresh and precise in my memory, with timestamps and direct quotes. I photographed the pool gate from the sidewalk, the lift visible in the distance. I pulled up the HOA governing documents, all 217 pages of them, and confirmed what I already suspected. The pool committee was mentioned nowhere. It had no authority, no bylaws, no legal standing. I found the relevant sections of the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title III, in the Fair Housing Act provisions, and I copied them into a document alongside Margaret's exact words about equipment not being designed for every type of situation. I found the contact information for the U.S. Department of Justice's HOA information line and the Regional HUD Fair Housing Office. I made a list of everything I had and everything I needed, and then I called my neighbor Trevor, who had mentioned once that he had a background in real estate law before he retired, and I asked if I could come over. Trevor listened to the whole story without interrupting. He is a quiet, methodical man in his mid-60s who speaks slowly and only when he has something worth saying, which means when he does speak, you pay very close attention. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You know, there's a camera on that gate, right? The board approved it in January. Margaret actually pushed for it at the November meeting." I stopped, said I didn't know that. He nodded and told me the HOA management company held the footage, that they were required to retain it for 30 days for liability purposes. I had been at the gate 9 days ago. The footage was almost certainly still there. I drove home, and I sat very still in my car in the driveway for a long moment. And then I went inside and opened my laptop and began writing the most carefully worded email of my entire life. The email I sent to the HOA management company that evening was 3 paragraphs long and carbon copied to the full HOA board. All 7 members, whose email addresses I had located in the governing documents. The first paragraph described the incident in factual, unemotional terms: date, time, location, name of individual involved, accommodation requested, accommodation denied, reason given. The second paragraph cited the specific ADA and Fair Housing Act provisions that Margaret Holloway's actions appeared to violate, along with the relevant case law Trevor had helped me identify that afternoon. The third paragraph requested 2 things. First, a written response from the board within 5 business days addressing the incident. And second, preservation of all security camera footage from the East Pool Gate dated July 11th between 9 and 10 in the morning. I noted that I was aware the camera existed and had been operational on the date in question. I noted that I was sending a simultaneous preservation request to the management company's legal department. I closed by stating that if no satisfactory response was received within the specified time frame, I would be filing a complaint with the Department of Justice, HOA Complaint Center, and contacting a disability rights attorney for a consultation. I reread it 4 times, adjusted to words, and pressed send. I did not sleep well that night. I kept thinking about the footage, whether it had captured the conversation clearly, whether the audio quality was sufficient, whether the camera angle included Margaret's face, or just the back of her head. I thought about what it would mean if it existed and what it would mean if it didn't. The documentation I had would still be powerful without it. But video evidence, especially video evidence that had been preserved by the HOA management company on a camera the HOA committee member had advocated for, that would transform the situation from a dispute between neighbors into something considerably more difficult to dismiss or minimize. At 6:17 in the morning, my phone buzzed with an email from the board's president, a man named Robert Finch, whom I had met twice at community events, and who had struck me as the kind of person who became an HOA board president, not because he craved authority, but because nobody else volunteered. His email was brief and somewhat alarmed in tone. He said he had received my message, was very concerned by the allegations, had already spoken to the management company about the footage. Could we please schedule a call that afternoon? He used the word allegations twice, which I noted. Without taking personally at that stage of any dispute, until the evidence is reviewed, everything is an allegation. I agreed to the call and spent the morning preparing. The call was at 2 o'clock and included Robert Finch, 2 other board members, a representative from the management company named Sandra, who spoke with the measured efficiency of someone who had navigated HOA legal issues before and had very specific opinions about her company's liability exposure. The management company had confirmed the footage existed. Sandra told me this directly and without preamble, which I respected. She said the camera had captured the exchange in full, that the audio was clear, and that upon review the footage corroborated my account of events. There was a pause after she said this. Robert Finch cleared his throat. One of the other board members, a woman named Patricia, who had not yet spoken, said quietly, "Oh my." I waited. Robert said that the board took this matter extremely seriously and wanted to assure me that the pool committee, he said those 2 words with a deliberate care that communicated, without explicitly stating that he was aware the committee had no formal standing, had not been authorized to implement any hold-on accessibility equipment. He said Margaret Holloway had acted outside her authority, said the lift was fully operational and Caleb was welcome at the pool immediately and unconditionally. And then Sandra said that the management company's legal team had also reviewed the footage and would be reaching out to me separately about resolution. Sandra said, "The audio was clear and the footage corroborated my account entirely." There was a long pause. The board member said quietly, "Oh my." And everything began to move very fast. The next 10 days were a blur of calls, emails, and document exchanges that I will not recount in exhaustive detail because the specifics are still partially subject to a confidentiality agreement. But I can tell you the broad shape of what happened because the broad shape is a matter of HOA record that I am free to discuss. The board held an emergency meeting 5 days after our call. The meeting minutes, which were distributed to all residents as required by the bylaws, stated that the pool committee had been formally dissolved, that no informal subcommittees had authority to restrict resident access to shared amenities, and that all accessibility equipment at the community pool would remain in full, unrestricted service at all times. They issued a formal written apology to Caleb and me, signed by all 7 board members, on HOA letterhead. Margaret Holloway resigned from all volunteer positions within the community the following week. I learned this from Trevor, not from any official communication, and I did not feel the triumphant satisfaction I might have expected. I felt something quieter and more complicated, a relief that was also exhaustion, a vindication that was also grief for the energy it had cost to arrive here. The disability rights attorney. I had consulted a woman named Carol Reyes who had been handling ADA cases for 19 years and who had the specific, unhurried confidence of someone who has won arguments like this many times before. Told me I had one of the cleaner cases she'd seen in recent years, partly because of the documentation, partly because of the footage, and partly because of that single sentence Margaret had said, "Some of the equipment here wasn't really designed with every type of situation in mind." Carol told me that sentence, on camera, was the kind of thing that makes opposing counsel very nervous. We discussed all available options and ultimately decided, given the board's swift corrective action and Caleb's well-being being the primary concern, to resolve the matter through a formal agreement rather than litigation. The terms of that agreement are what I cannot discuss in detail. What I can say is that Caleb will never again be turned away from that pool, or any community pool, without significant consequences for the parties responsible, On the last Saturday of July, 18 days after we had been turned away at the gate, Caleb and Marcus went swimming. I had told Caleb the night before that the lift was available and everything had been sorted, and he had responded with a fist pump so emphatic it knocked over his glass of water, which he then helped clean up without being asked, which is the kind of person he is. We packed the swim bag the same way we always had: floaties, water shoes, Velcro straps, PF50, juice boxes, the laminated accommodation card, and we walked the same 4 blocks past Mrs. Okonkwo's roses and the Peterson fence that still hadn't been repainted, and we arrived at the east gate of Sycamore Ridge Community Pool at 9:20 in the morning. The gate was unattended. There was no clipboard, no committee, nobody stationed there to evaluate whether my son's needs were compatible with community standards. There was just a gate, and it was unlocked, and we walked through it, watching Caleb use the pool lift. That morning is an experience I will carry for the rest of my life. The lift is a simple mechanism, a motorized seat that lowers the user smoothly from the pool deck down into the water, eliminating the need for the steps he couldn't safely manage. Caleb had used it dozens of times and was completely comfortable with it, but Marcus had never seen it before and watched with the frank, appreciative curiosity of a child encountering something genuinely impressive. As the lift lowered Caleb into the water, Marcus said, "That's actually the coolest thing I've ever seen." The sincerity so complete it was almost formal. And Caleb grinned, the grin I live for, the wide, uncomplicated, full-face smile of a kid who is exactly where he wants to be, doing exactly what he loves with his best friend watching. He pushed off from the lift seat into the water and immediately began demonstrating to Marcus how to do what he called the starfish float. Arms and legs spread wide, face to the sky. They spent 2.5 hours in that pool. I sat on the deck and watched them and cried for about 4 minutes, very quietly behind my sunglasses. And then I pulled myself together and ate half a granola bar and watched them some more. I have thought a lot since all of this happened about why I'm sharing this story publicly, and I want to be honest about my reasoning because I think it matters. I am not telling it because I want to humiliate Margaret Holloway. I genuinely don't. I have no interest in reducing her to a villain or a meme or a cautionary tale about a certain kind of entitled suburban woman. Internet has a very specific and enthusiastic appetite for that framing. She did something wrong, something that hurt my son, and that was legally indefensible, and she was held accountable for it. That is the complete version of events as far as my personal feelings are concerned. What I want people to take from this story is not a satisfying moment of comeuppance, though I understand the appeal of that narrative, but something more structural and more durable. An understanding of how often the parents of disabled children are put in the position of having to fight for access to things that are legally guaranteed, emotionally obvious, and fundamentally basic. I am not sharing this story for the satisfaction of the ending. I am sharing it for everyone who is still standing at the gate without a camera at their backs fighting the same fight. Alone, the ADA was signed into law in 1990. It has been more than 30 years. And yet the experience of navigating the world with a disabled child in this country is still, in 2024, an experience characterized to an extraordinary degree by the need to constantly educate, assert, document, push back, and sometimes fight. The lift at our community pool did not need to be a controversy. Caleb's access did not need to be a negotiation. These things were settled by federal law decades before we moved into this neighborhood. What Margaret Holloway did was not a bureaucratic misunderstanding or a procedural error. It was an expression of a belief that some people's needs are optional, that accessibility accommodations are a courtesy rather than a right, that disabled people and their families should accept the conditions offered rather than demanding the conditions owed. That belief is not rare. It lives in HOA committees and school boards and doctors' offices and hiring, decisions and architectural choices, in 1,000 places where it causes damage quietly and systematically, and largely without accountability. The camera made it accountable. This time, most of the time, there is no camera. What I want, when I imagine the best possible outcome from sharing this, is for someone, maybe several someones, to read it and do something concrete. If you are on an HOA board or a parks committee or a school board or any body that governs shared spaces, audit your accessibility right now, not when a complaint arrives. Now, if you are the parent of a disabled child who has been denied access to something your child is legally entitled to, know that the law is on your side and that documentation is your most powerful tool, and that you do not have to accept no as a final answer. If you are a neighbor, a bystander, a witness to these small daily exclusions, say something. The moments that change things are rarely dramatic. They are usually quiet, procedural, clipboard-wielding, and utterly convinced of their own reasonableness. The most important thing you can do is refuse to let that reasonableness go unchallenged. Caleb is swimming now, every Tuesday and Thursday, and Marcus comes sometimes. And the lift works perfectly, and the gate is open. That is how it should be. That is how it should have always been. And the fact that it took a security camera and a federal complaint and 18 days of legal maneuvers to arrive at something so plainly basic is exactly the part of this story I most want you to remember when you close this page and go back to your day. The last time we walked to the pool. 2 weeks ago, Caleb announced halfway down the block that he had decided he wanted to be a civil rights lawyer when he grew up. He had apparently been thinking about this since the resolution and had questions. Did lawyers have to wear suits every day? Could a lawyer also be a person who talked to birds? Is it a job you could do with a service dog because he thought a service dog would be good to have? I told him yes to the suits question on court days, yes to the birds, and that I would look into the service dog situation because I suspected the answer was also yes. He said cool and scooted ahead of me down the sidewalk. And I followed at my own pace, watching him go. And I thought, there are ordinary Tuesday mornings that don't warn you they're going to matter. And then there are the ones that remind you why all of this. The fighting, the documentation, the 3-paragraph emails, the sleepless nights, the years of pushing through a world that was designed around other people's children is worth every single exhausting, essential moment.